Elaine Thompson, a 62-year-old cleaner at Millbrook Regional Airport, wiped the sweat from her brow and stretched her tired back. She had been scrubbing floors and picking up trash for over 3 decades. On most days, Elaine found a certain peace in the routine, moving unnoticed through the busy terminal. But today was different. Delayed flights and agitated passengers filled the air with tension, leaving messes everywhere. She moved from gate to gate with her mop and bucket, hoping to finish her shift before the chaos worsened. As she bent down to clean a coffee spill near a waiting area, Elaine's ears caught the sharp sound of a heated argument. Curious but hesitant, she glanced toward the source, a well-dressed couple arguing with their teenage daughter. The girl, tears streaming down her face, begged them not to send her away to boarding school. "You're just like your father. Always disappointing," the mother snapped, her voice cold and unforgiving. Elaine's hands froze mid-scrub. Those words hit too close to home, stirring memories she had buried long ago. Her ex-husband, David, had walked out on her and their 5-year-old twins, Mark and Sophie, 30 years ago. His last words still haunted her. "I'm not cut out for this family thing, Elaine. You're better off without me." The weight of that old pain pressed against her chest, but Elaine shook her head, forcing the memory away. She stood up, taking a deep breath, and approached the arguing family. "Excuse me," Elaine said gently. "I couldn't help but overhear. Maybe you folks could use a quieter place to talk things out." The father turned to snap at her, irritation written across his face. But when he met Elaine's kind, steady gaze, his anger softened. "Yeah, that might be a good idea," he muttered. Elaine smiled and led them to a small, unused waiting area tucked away from the crowded terminal. As they followed, the mother mumbled under her breath, "I can't believe we're taking advice from a cleaning lady." Elaine didn't mind. She had learned long ago that true strength came from kindness, not status. Once the family settled into the quiet corner, their voices softened. The daughter stopped crying, and the tension between them seemed to ease. Elaine returned to her cleaning, but as she pushed her mop across the floor, a strange feeling settled in her chest, something that felt like closure, however small. Just as she started to relax, her supervisor, Tom, came rushing toward her. "Elaine, you won't believe this," Tom said, catching his breath. "Someone recorded you helping that family, and it's going viral." Elaine blinked, confused. "Viral? What do you mean?" Tom held up his phone, showing her a video that had already racked up thousands of views. Strangers in the comments were praising Elaine's compassion and wisdom, calling her the airport angel. Elaine's heart pounded. She had spent years working quietly, unnoticed by the world. Now thousands of strangers were watching her, commenting on her life. "I don't know about this, Tom," Elaine whispered, her voice unsteady. "I'm not comfortable with all this attention." Tom patted her shoulder reassuringly. "Don't worry, Elaine. This will blow over soon. Just keep doing what you do best." Elaine tried to return to her work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, for better or worse. Her quiet life was about to change, and she had no idea what lay ahead. Elaine stood at the airport, mop in hand, feeling the weight of the day settling into her bones. As the family she helped earlier began talking quietly, she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She never expected gratitude or recognition. After all, she was just doing what she'd always done, help where she could and keep her head down. But her peace didn't last long. Her supervisor, Tom, came rushing toward her with a grin stretched across his face, holding his phone like a prize. "Elaine, you won't believe this," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. Elaine frowned, confused. "What is it, Tom?" He thrust the phone in front of her, and there on the screen was a video, a clip of her leading the arguing family to a quiet spot. "Someone recorded you helping that family and posted it online. It's going viral." Her heart skipped a beat. Viral. The word felt strange and out of place in her world of mops and buckets. She stared at the video, watching herself on screen, leading the family with quiet grace. The comments below the video were pouring in rapidly. "What a sweet soul. The world needs more people like her. Bless this woman. She's the real angel we need. No job title defines kindness. That lady is incredible. Elaine blinked, overwhelmed. The numbers on the video kept climbing. Thousands of views and hundreds of comments within minutes. Felt surreal. She had spent over 30 years cleaning this airport without a second glance from anyone. Now, suddenly, she was an airport angel. I don't know how I feel about this, Tom, she said, her voice uneasy. I didn't do anything special. I was just doing my job. Tom gave her a reassuring smile. It's not about the job, Elaine. It's about who you are. People see that. Elaine shook her head, uneasy with the attention. She liked her quiet life, the anonymity it provided. Fame, even if it was fleeting, didn't sit right with her. This will pass, right? She asked, hoping for reassurance. Of course, Tom said, patting her shoulder. Give it a few days and the internet will move on to the next thing. Just keep doing what you do best. Trying to take comfort in his words, Elaine returned to her cleaning, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she pulled it out, she saw dozens of missed calls and text notifications. Strangers were tagging her in posts, reporters were reaching out, and her inbox was full of messages. People offering praise, support, and even interview requests. Elaine felt overwhelmed. For decades, she had moved through life like a ghost, invisible to the world. Now, everyone seemed to know her name, and the sudden spotlight was unsettling. She tucked her phone away, hoping to block out the noise. But something told her this wasn't going to blow over so easily. Just as she tried to focus on her work, her phone buzzed again. This time, an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. Hello. Is this Elaine Thompson? A woman's voice asked. Yes, this is she, Elaine replied cautiously, her heart beginning to race. I'm calling from Omaha Central Hospital, the woman said gently. It's about your ex-husband, David. He's been admitted and is asking for you. The air seemed to thicken around Elaine. David. After 30 years of silence, now he was calling for her. Didn't make sense. She gripped the mop tighter, trying to steady herself. What happened? She managed to ask. He suffered a severe heart attack, the nurse explained. He's stable, but his condition is serious. He specifically asked for you. Elaine's mind spun. David, the man who had walked out on her and their children decades ago, was now lying in a hospital bed, asking for her by name. After all this time, why? What could he possibly want? Mrs. Thompson. Are you still there? The nurse asked, her voice gentle but persistent. Elaine swallowed hard. Yes, I'm here, she said, her voice shaky. I don't understand. Why would he want to see me after all these years? The nurse paused briefly, then added. He says he has something important to tell you. Something about your past. Elaine's free hand clenched into a fist. What kind of game was David playing now? Thank you for letting me know, she said, her voice stiff. I'll think about it. As she hung up, a strange sense of unease settled over her. Before she could process the news, she noticed a small crowd gathering nearby. People were pointing, whispering, and holding up their phones. Panic crept into her chest as she realized they were filming her. Tom appeared at her side, concern written across his face. Elaine, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Elaine shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. I need to go home, Tom. Family emergency. Tom's expression softened. Course. Take all the time you need. Don't worry about the attention. It'll die down soon. But as Elaine gathered her things and hurried out of the airport, she knew deep down that her quiet life had already been shattered. And with David back in the picture, things were about to become even more complicated. As Elaine sat in her small living room, she stared at the phone in her hand, still reeling from the hospital's call. David, her ex-husband, the man who walked out on her and their children 30 years ago, was in the hospital asking to see her. Conflicting emotions churned inside her. Anger, confusion, and a strange curiosity. Why now? Why, after 3 decades, would he want to see her? Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of her phone. It was her son, Mark. She hesitated, knowing the conversation wouldn't be easy, but answered the call. Mom. Mark's voice was tight with concern. What's going on? Sophie just sent me a video, some clip of you at the airport. You're all over the internet. Elaine sighed heavily. It's nothing, Mark. Just a misunderstanding at work. Someone recorded me helping a family. And now people are calling me the airport angel. Mark's voice was sharp. It's not nothing, Mom. Your video is viral. It's all over social media. But that's not why I'm calling. His tone shifted, more cautious. I got a message from Dad. Elaine froze, her heart skipping a beat. You heard from David? Yeah, Mark said, his voice hardening. He's in the hospital. He says he needs to see all of us. What's going on, Mom? Elaine rubbed her temple, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. I got a call from the hospital too. David had a heart attack, but he's stable now. He asked for me specifically. Said he had something important to tell me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Mark's voice came through, low and simmering with anger. You're not going, right? After everything he did. He doesn't deserve your time, Mom. Elaine sighed, torn between her son's pain and her own unresolved emotions. I don't know, Mark. Part of me wants to ignore it, but maybe we need closure. If not for him, then for us. Mark's frustration boiled over. Closure. Mom, he abandoned us. He left you to raise me and Sophie on your own. You don't owe him anything. I know, Elaine whispered, her heart heavy with the memories of years spent struggling alone. But it's been 30 years, Mark. Maybe hearing what he has to say will help us move on. Mark's voice softened slightly, though his frustration still lingered. Don't do anything until I get there, okay? I'll come home, and we'll figure this out together. Elaine felt a flicker of relief at her son's offer. Okay, sweetheart. We'll talk when you get here. As she hung up the phone, a knot of anxiety settled in her stomach. She paced the small living room, glancing out the window at the quiet street outside. What could David possibly want to tell her now? And how would her children handle his sudden reappearance in their lives? Her phone buzzed again, and she saw messages piling up. Texts from Sophie and Mark, notifications from social media, and even emails from reporters wanting interviews about her viral video. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the quiet life Elaine had built over the years seemed to unravel with each new notification. Elaine sank into her armchair, feeling the weight of her 62 years. She thought about calling Sophie to explain everything but hesitated. What would she even say? Hey honey, guess what? The father who abandoned you and your brother wants to reconnect from his hospital bed. The thought made her stomach churn. She knew how much pain David's absence had caused her children. Reopening those wounds now felt like a betrayal, but ignoring him felt equally wrong. With a deep breath, Elaine leaned her head back against the chair, closing her eyes. Her quiet life, the one she had carefully built, was slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure how to stop it. All she knew was that, for better or worse, David's sudden reappearance had set something in motion, something she couldn't control. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as Elaine sat at the edge of her couch, her thoughts tangled. The news of David's sudden reappearance after 3 decades left her feeling adrift. 30 years of silence, abandonment, and struggle flashed before her eyes. Moments where she had carried the weight of raising her children alone, with no help or explanation from the man who walked away. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. This time it was her daughter, Sophie. Elaine let it ring, not ready for another conversation. Just as she put the phone down, the front door opened, and Mark entered the house. He threw his bag on the floor, his face lined with frustration. I can't believe we're even considering this, Mom, Mark said, pacing the living room. After everything he did to us, why does he deserve anything from you? His voice was sharp, full of anger that had simmered for years. Elaine leaned back on the couch, exhausted. It's not about what he deserves, Mark. Maybe it's about what we need. She tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart was heavy with doubt. Mark stopped and faced her. He had 30 years to reach out, and he didn't. Why now? What makes you think he's changed? Elaine rubbed her hands together, searching for the right words. I don't know, Mark. But what if hearing him out helps us find closure? What if it gives us a chance to finally let go of the past? Mark scoffed, crossing his arms. Closure. Mom, the man walked out on us when Sophie and I were kids. He left you to work yourself to the bone. Closure doesn't come from listening to the excuses of a man like that. Elaine flinched at his words, the truth of them striking deep. But still, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, what if David really did have something important to say? Mark sank into the armchair opposite her, running his hand through his hair in frustration. There's something I didn't tell you, he said quietly. His voice suddenly more measured. Elaine sat up straighter. What do you mean? Mark exhaled slowly. Dad tried to contact me a few times over the years. Sent me birthday cards, letters. I sent them back. I didn't want anything to do with him. Elaine felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her. He reached out to you, she whispered, her heart tightening. Mark nodded, avoiding her gaze. I thought it was better not to tell you or Sophie. I didn't want to drag you back into that mess. Elaine stared at him, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Hurt, confusion, anger. All those years, David had been reaching out to Mark, and she had never known. He had been absent from her life, yet he had tried, however imperfectly, to reconnect with their son. The revelation stung more than she expected. Mark looked at her, guilt flickering in his eyes. I didn't think it mattered. I thought we were better off without him. Elaine swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. I understand why you didn't tell me, she said softly. But it does matter, Mark. It changes things. Mark shook his head. He can't just come back into our lives like this. Not after all this time. Elaine stood, needing to move. She walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street. I know, she said quietly. But maybe we should hear him out. If not for him, then for us. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know, Mom. Feels like a mistake. Elaine turned back to him, her expression soft but resolute. I don't want to carry this anger anymore, Mark. I've carried it for too long. I need to know why he's reaching out now. Mark gave her a reluctant nod, though the tension in his jaw remained. Okay. But we do this on our terms, not his. Elaine smiled faintly, grateful for his support. Agreed. As they sat in the quiet room, the weight of the past still hung heavily between them. But for the first time in a long while, Elaine felt the smallest glimmer of hope. A hope that maybe they could finally confront the ghosts of their past and find a way to move forward. Elaine stood near the arrivals gate at Millbrook Regional Airport, nervously shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind. Viral videos, reporters, the shocking news about David, and now the arrival of Mark. Her heart raced as passengers streamed out of the gate. She pulled her jacket tighter, hoping to blend into the crowd. But the stares, the whispers, and the occasional phone raised for a sneaky photo reminded her that anonymity was no longer an option. Then she spotted him. Mark, with his jaw clenched and his shoulders stiff, cut through the crowd like a storm cloud ready to burst. When he saw her, he dropped his bag and pulled her into a tight hug. Mom, he whispered, his voice low but full of emotion. Are you okay? Elaine nodded, forcing a small smile. I'm fine, honey. Just overwhelmed. They pulled apart, and Mark's expression hardened. As they walked toward the parking lot, his frustration simmered just below the surface. Elaine knew the conversation they needed to have was going to be difficult. The moment they reached the car, Mark exploded. I can't believe you're even considering going to see him, Mom. After everything he put us through, why would you do this? Elaine sighed, leaning against the car door. I know you're angry, Mark. Him too. But maybe, just maybe, we need to hear what he has to say. For us, not for him. Mark threw his hands in the air. What could he possibly say that would make any of this better? He left us, Mom. He didn't care then, and he doesn't deserve your time now. His voice grew louder, attracting curious glances from passers-by. Please, Mark, Elaine whispered, glancing around as more people began to notice them. Let's not do this here. But Mark was too far gone. His emotions finally spilling over after years of being bottled up. No, Mom. I want to know why. Why now? Why, after 30 years, does he suddenly want to talk? What does he think he can fix with a conversation? Tears stung Elaine's eyes, but she fought to keep her voice steady. I don't know, Mark. But if we don't hear him out, we'll carry this anger forever. I've carried it long enough, and I don't want you and Sophie to carry it too. Mark's voice cracked with emotion. He doesn't deserve closure. He doesn't deserve anything from us. Suddenly, a man approached them, his phone raised. Excuse me, aren't you the airport angel? Can I get a picture? Elaine's heart sank, horrified that this deeply personal moment was becoming yet another public spectacle. Please, not now, she whispered, trying to keep her composure. The man lowered his phone, looking sheepish. Sorry, I didn't realize. I'll leave you alone. As he walked away, Elaine noticed more people slowing down, some pulling out their phones to film. The pressure of the eyes on them was suffocating. She turned to Mark, her voice urgent. Let's go. We can talk at home. The drive back was tense and silent. Mark's frustration filled the space between them like a storm waiting to break. When they finally reached home, he slumped onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to blow up like that. Elaine sat beside him, placing a hand on his arm. It's okay, Mark. This isn't easy for any of us. He exhaled heavily, the anger giving way to sadness. It's just, seeing you go through this again, after everything, I don't want you to get hurt. Elaine smiled softly, though her heart ached. I know, sweetheart. But maybe facing this will help us all heal. Mark nodded reluctantly, the tension easing slightly between them. But the questions still lingered in the air, questions neither of them knew the answers to yet. All Elaine knew was that the past, no matter how long buried, had resurfaced. And now there was no turning back. Elaine stood outside David's hospital room, her hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the doorknob. The hallway felt suffocatingly quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors from nearby rooms. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. 30 years. 30 years since the man inside had walked out of her life, leaving her to raise 2 children alone. Now here she was, face to face with a past she thought she had buried. With one last exhale, Elaine pushed open the door. David lay in the hospital bed, looking much older and frilier than she remembered. His once dark hair was now gray, and the lines etched across his face told a story of years not lived well. As their eyes met, a flicker of recognition passed between them. David gave a weak smile, his voice hoarse. Elaine. You came. Elaine stepped inside cautiously, her arms crossed in front of her. What do you want, David? Why now? David tried to push himself up in bed, wincing slightly from the effort. I needed to see you. I know I don't deserve your time, but I had to explain. Elaine's jaw tightened. Explain. You walked out on me and our children, David. You abandoned us without a word. What could you possibly have to explain? David looked down at his hands, the weight of guilt visibly pulling him down. You're right. I was a coward. I thought you'd be better off without me. He paused, swallowing hard. But that's not why I asked to see you. Elaine narrowed her eyes, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Then why, David? Why now? David hesitated for a moment before continuing, his voice low. It's not just about the heart attack. There's something I've kept from you for years. Something I need to make right. He reached for a folder resting on the bedside table, his hand shaking slightly as he passed it to her. Elaine opened the folder, her heart pounding. Inside were bank statements, legal documents, and trust fund information. What is this? She asked, flipping through the papers. David leaned back against the pillows, a look of shame crossing his face. About 10 years ago I won the lottery. A big one, $50 million. Elaine's breath hitched, and her hands trembled as she held the documents. 50 million, she whispered, disbelief washing over her. All those years I struggled to make ends meet, worked double shifts, raised our children alone. And you had millions? David closed his eyes, guilt etched across his features. I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I was ashamed of how I left things. Ashamed that I wasn't there for you and the kids. Elaine's anger boiled over. Ashamed. You were ashamed. Her voice shook with fury. Do you have any idea what we went through? What I went through? While you were sitting on millions, your children had to give up everything because we couldn't afford it. And now you think throwing money at us will fix it. David's face crumpled. I know I can't fix the past, but I want to make things right, Elaine. I set up trust funds for Mark and Sophie. And for you too. Elaine slammed the folder shut, her heart pounding in her chest. Money doesn't erase what you did, David. It won't bring back the years you missed, the birthdays you forgot, or the nights I cried myself to sleep. David's voice cracked as he pleaded, I know, Elaine. I know it's not enough. But it's all I have to give. Elaine took a step back, her emotions swirling, anger, betrayal, sadness, and something unexpected, the faintest flicker of closure. For years, she had carried the burden of his abandonment. Now, finally, she saw the man he had become, a broken, regretful shadow of the man who once left her behind. I didn't come here for your money, David, Elaine whispered, her voice steadier now. I came here to finally close this chapter. Not for you, but for me. As she turned toward the door, David called out softly, Elaine. I am sorry. She paused for a moment, her hand on the doorknob, but didn't look back. Some things can't be fixed, David. They can only be lived with. Without another word, she stepped out of the room, leaving David behind. Her heart felt heavy, but lighter at the same time, like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally begun to lift. In the hallway, Elaine noticed curious glances from nurses and visitors, some with their phones out. It was then she realized. Her conversation with David had been accidentally live-streamed by the hospital's equipment. Her private moment, her confrontation with the past, was now public for the world to see. Elaine exhaled slowly, trying to hold on to the fragile sense of peace she had found. She had faced the man who abandoned her, confronted the pain she had buried for years, and walked away on her own terms. No amount of money could undo the damage, but at least now, she could finally begin to let it go. Elaine's footsteps echoed down the hallway as she left David's hospital room. Her hands clutched the folder of trust fund documents, but her mind swirled with emotions too overwhelming to process. Anger, betrayal, sadness, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her, making each step feel like a struggle. As she paused to catch her breath, she heard a nurse's voice behind her. Excuse me, Miss Thompson. I'm so sorry, but your conversation with Mr. Evans was accidentally live-streamed through the hospital's internal system. It's gone viral. Elaine's stomach sank. What do you mean viral? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse looked mortified. The feed was activated by mistake. The video is all over social media now. Elaine closed her eyes, pressing her palm against her forehead. Not only had her private moment with David been exposed, but it was now public fodder for strangers to judge, dissect, and comment on. The thought made her feel nauseous. Gathering what little strength she had, Elaine headed toward the exit. As she reached the hospital lobby, she could already feel the weight of people's stares. Some were filming her with their phones, while others whispered as she walked by. She pushed through the crowd, her pulse quickening. Once outside, the fresh air hit her like a wave, but it did little to soothe the chaos in her mind. She spotted her son, Mark, waiting for her near the entrance, his expression tense and guarded. Mark rushed toward her, concern etched across his face. Mom, I saw the video. Are you okay? Elaine gave him a tired smile. I'm fine, honey. Let's just get out of here. They drove home in silence, the folder of trust fund documents sitting on the passenger seat between them like a reminder of everything that had just transpired. When they reached the house, Elaine slumped onto the couch, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones. Mark sat beside her, glancing at the folder. What did he say? Elaine exhaled slowly. He won the lottery, Mark. 10 years ago. $50 million. Mark's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. All those years we struggled. And he had millions. Elaine nodded, her voice quiet but steady. He was too ashamed to reach out. Said he didn't know how to make things right. Mark's anger boiled over. And now he thinks throwing money at us will fix everything. He stood up, pacing the room. How could he, after everything we went through? Elaine watched him with sympathy, knowing exactly how he felt. I told him money won't erase what he did, Mark. It won't bring back the birthdays, the school plays, or the nights we spent wondering why he left. Mark shook his head, his voice filled with bitterness. He doesn't deserve anything from us, Mom. Elaine leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. Maybe not. But holding on to this anger, carrying it around all these years, it's exhausting, Mark. I just want to let it go. Mark sat down beside her again, his voice softening. So, what are you going to do? Elaine gave him a tired but resolute look. We'll take the trust funds. Not for him but for us, for a fresh start. Mark frowned. Do you really think that will help? Elaine placed a hand on his arm. I don't know, but it's a chance to build something new. And we deserve that. Mark sighed, leaning back into the couch. Yeah. Maybe you're right. They sat together in the quiet living room, the tension between them easing, though the scars of the past remained. Elaine knew it would take time. Time to heal, to forgive herself, and to figure out what their new beginning would look like. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like the weight of the past was finally beginning to lift. As she looked at her son, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough. The ride home from the hospital was steeped in silence, broken only by the occasional buzz of Elaine's phone. Each notification was a reminder that their private confrontation with David had become public. Elaine ignored the sounds, her fingers drumming anxiously against the folder of trust fund documents on her lap. Her mind was still reeling from David's revelations, and now the knowledge that the entire world had witnessed her most vulnerable moment left her feeling exposed and exhausted. When they pulled into the driveway, Mark parked the car and turned off the engine. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. It's everywhere, isn't it? He asked quietly. Elaine nodded. Looks like it. Mark exhaled through his nose, frustration radiating off him. We didn't ask for any of this. No, we didn't. Elaine's voice was low and tired, her anger simmering beneath the surface. They got out of the car and walked toward the house. As they reached the front door, Elaine noticed two unfamiliar cars parked nearby. Her stomach twisted. Reporters. She knew this wouldn't end easily. She had become a spectacle, whether she liked it or not. Once inside, they found the living room exactly as they had left it, quiet and undisturbed. But it no longer felt like the sanctuary it had been. Elaine slumped onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. The pressure of the past few days weighed on her, and she knew the fallout had only just begun. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she reluctantly checked it. A message from Sophie read, Mom, what's going on? I just saw a video of you and Mark. It's everywhere. Elaine sighed deeply and texted back, Come home, sweetheart. We need to talk. Moments later, her phone rang. It was Sophie. Elaine answered, her heart heavy. Hi, honey. Mom, what happened? I lost an art commission today because of that video, Sophie said, her voice tight with frustration. They said they didn't want to be associated with the controversy. Elaine's heart sank. Oh, Sophie. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was already struggling, Mom. This was my big break, and now it's gone, Sophie said, her voice breaking. Maybe I should just quit. No, Sophie, don't say that. Elaine's voice softened. You're talented. You can't let this stop you. Sophie sniffled on the other end. I don't know, Mom. It feels like everything's falling apart. Elaine's chest ached with guilt. She had spent years holding her family together, and now it felt as if the past was unraveling everything. We'll figure this out, Sophie. Promise. Just come home and we'll get through it together. As she hung up, Elaine looked over at Mark, who sat silently on the couch, his hands clasped together in front of him. It's not just about us, is it? He muttered. This is affecting Sophie too. Elaine nodded. The past always finds a way of catching up with you, no matter how hard you try to leave it behind. Mark rubbed his eyes, exhaustion catching up with him. What are we supposed to do now, Mom? Elaine leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. We take it one step at a time. That's all we can do. The sound of a car door slamming outside made them both tense. Elaine stood up and peeked out the window. Reporters were gathering on the sidewalk, cameras in hand, waiting for a glimpse of her. Mark joined her at the window, shaking his head. This isn't going away, is it? Elaine sighed. No, it's not. But we'll handle it, Mark. We've handled worse. The weight of everything, David's reappearance, the viral video, Sophie's struggles, pressed down on Elaine, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to let the past define her or her family's future. We'll face it together, she whispered. And we'll come out stronger. Elaine needed air. The weight of the last few days felt suffocating. David's revelations, the viral videos, and now Sophie's lost opportunity. Without a word to Mark, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. For years, she had kept her head down, navigating life's challenges without complaint. But now, with her personal struggles laid bare for the world, it felt like everything was unraveling. She found herself walking back to the one place that had always brought her peace, St. Mary's Church. It wasn't far from the airport, and over the years, she had visited the quiet sanctuary whenever life became overwhelming. As Elaine entered, the familiar scent of old wood and candle wax filled the air, soothing her nerves. She slipped into one of the back pews, hoping for a few moments of stillness. But before she could close her eyes, a young woman nearby whispered, "Excuse me. Aren't you the lady from that viral video?" Elaine sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Yes, that's me. Can I get a selfie with you?" the woman asked, already lifting her phone. Elaine forced a smile. "Please." "Not right now." The woman apologized and quickly backed away, but the damage was done. Elaine's sanctuary had been invaded. She rested her head in her hands, realizing that no place, no matter how sacred, could shield her from the public's prying eyes. Just as she was about to leave, Pastor Jim appeared, his face kind and familiar. "Elaine," he greeted softly, "it's good to see you. Come, let's talk in my office." In the quiet of his small office, Elaine let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how to handle all this, Jim. I never wanted any attention. Now I can't escape it." The pastor nodded, listening intently. "It's not easy, Elaine. But from what I've seen, you've handled yourself with grace. You've helped people without expecting anything in return. And that's why people are drawn to you." Elaine shook her head. "It doesn't feel like grace. It feels like everything's spinning out of control." Pastor Jim gave her a reassuring smile. "Maybe the storm isn't meant to break you. Maybe it's meant to help you find a new path." Before Elaine could respond, her phone buzzed again. It was Sophie. "I'm at the house. Where are you, Mom?" Elaine stood up, suddenly eager to return home. "Thank you, Jim," she said softly. "I think I know what I need to do." She hurried back to her house, where Sophie was waiting on the porch, arms crossed and looking frustrated. Elaine pulled her daughter into a hug before Sophie could say anything. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Sophie relaxed slightly in her mother's arms. "It's not your fault, Mom. I'm just overwhelmed." Elaine nodded. "Me too. But we're going to figure this out together." Inside, Mark joined them in the living room. Elaine sat down with her children, the trust fund documents in front of her. We have a choice to make, she said, looking at them both. We can take what David offered and start fresh. Or we can walk away. Mark frowned but stayed quiet. Sophie gave a small nod. Think. We should use it. Not for him but for us. Elaine smiled, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in days. Then that's what we'll do. This is our chance to build something new. For the first time in a long while, Elaine felt hopeful. The past may have found its way back into their lives, but now they had the power to shape their future, and they would face it together. Elaine sat at the kitchen table, the folder of trust fund documents lying between her and her children, Mark and Sophie. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, confronting David, the viral video, and the struggles that had resurfaced between them. But for the first time, Elaine felt a sense of clarity. They weren't going to let the past control their future. I know this isn't easy, Elaine began, looking from Mark to Sophie. But we've spent too long carrying anger and pain. We deserve more than that. Mark leaned back in his chair, still tense but listening. I just don't want him to think he can buy our forgiveness with money, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. He can't, Elaine said firmly. This isn't about him. It's about us. We can use this money to start over. For ourselves. Sophie, who had been quiet until now, nodded slowly. I think we should take it, Mom. Not because it fixes anything, but because it'll help us move forward. Mark exhaled, his anger softening into reluctant acceptance. I guess. It's not about forgiving him. It's about not letting him have power over us anymore. Elaine gave them both a small, grateful smile. Exactly. We've held on to that hurt for too long. It's time to let it go. As they sat in silence for a moment, the weight between them seemed to lift just a little. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Healing, Elaine knew, would take time. But at least they were beginning. Later that evening, Mark excused himself to take a walk, leaving Elaine and Sophie in the living room. Sophie curled up on the couch beside her mother, resting her head on Elaine's shoulder. I was so mad, Mom, Sophie whispered. When I lost that commission, I felt like everything was falling apart. Elaine stroked her daughter's hair gently. I know, sweetheart, but you're strong. One setback doesn't define you. You'll find another way. Sophie smiled softly. Thanks, Mom. I just needed to hear that. Elaine kissed the top of Sophie's head. And I'll always be here to remind you. For the first time in days, the house felt calm. The storm of emotions that had raged between them was beginning to settle. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but it felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild their family with honesty, love, and acceptance. The next morning, Elaine stood at the airport, ready to return to her routine. But this time things felt different. As she walked through the terminal, she no longer carried the same weight of the past. She greeted her co-workers with a genuine smile, grateful for the chance to continue her work without the burden of unresolved anger. As she mopped the floor, a familiar voice called out to her. Ethan, the kind pilot she had met days earlier, approached with a friendly grin. How are you holding up? He asked. Elaine smiled. Better, actually. One day at a time. Ethan nodded. That's all any of us can do. They chatted for a few minutes, and for the first time in a long while, Elaine felt lighter. She realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant choosing not to let it define her. As she finished her shift and watched a plane take off from the runway, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. The future, uncertain as it was, felt like a blank canvas. And for the first time, she was ready to paint a new picture for herself and her family.